Audio lecture for Unit 4A, Classical Era, Persia, and Early Greece. We're going to first start by talking about some characteristics of classical civilizations in general. During the Classical Age, which is between 600 BC and 600 AD, the number and size of key states and empires grew dramatically. You can look at the map here and see all of the areas where we see empires growing during this classical era. Rulers imposed political unity on areas where previously there had been competing states. So we have a consolidation of power that's going on, a solidifying of control under centralized governments. Empires and states developed new techniques of imperial administration based partially on the success of earlier political forms. They would just build on what they had seen before. We saw this in classical Asia, with the mandate of heaven being expanded and the power of the emperor in China expanding as a result of that. When we discussed Han China, the Han Chinese built upon the grassroots and the foundations that had been laid by the Qin dynasty. These techniques included the creation of centralized governments, bureaucracies, and elaborate legal systems, especially by the time we get to the Roman Empire, which we will in a later unit. Imperial governments promoted trade and projected military power over larger areas. Again, we've talked before about the difference between an empire, which is an imperial government, and a kingdom. A kingdom is smaller. A kingdom usually is a governor over his own people, but when he decides to conquer another area and expand his territory, that is called an empire. Governments usually issued currencies, so there would be a common system of currency throughout the empire. It will aid in trade. They also engage in diplomacy, which means contact and negotiations being made with other empires or other kingdoms. They also developed supply lines to make sure their trade moved smoothly. Oftentimes this would also mean building infrastructure like roads and canals and bridges and those kinds of things. And you also see them building fortifications and defensive walls around their capital cities in particular, but also other key points in their empire. Roads will be something that will be very important, not just for trade, but also to keep communication lines open, as well as to have areas where the military can keep tabs on the far-flung parts of the empire. Governments often relied also on new groups of military officers and soldiers from their own populations as well as from conquered peoples. Imperial cities served as centers of trade, public performances of religious rituals, and political administration for states and empires. The cities will become more and more important during the classical age due to the consolidation of power in these empires. Imperial social structures also displayed hierarchies, including farmers, laborers, slaves, artisans, merchants, elites, as well as caste groups in some areas, like India. Empires also used various methods to maintain food production, including slavery and corvée labor, which is unpaid labor in lieu of taxation. In other words, required labor that you are required to provide for the government in lieu of paying a tax. You provide manual labor. Imperial societies also provided rewards for the loyalty of the elite groups. Commoners paid elites rent or tribute, oftentimes. Patriarchy continued to shape gender and family relations in all imperial societies of the classical age. We'll continue to talk about this as we go through all of the units in the classical period. Empires also faced political, cultural, economic, environmental, and administrative difficulties that led to their decline and or collapse. It just depended upon where you were, how long those empires would last. But as we will see, by the end of the classical era, most of the empires fade in exchange for new empires being created or new kingdoms being created. Governments generated social tensions and economic difficulties, oftentimes by concentrating too much power and wealth in the hands of the elites. And eventually this would lead to disgruntled citizens that would rebel. Security issues also along their frontiers, especially larger empires like the Roman Empire, would also include the threat of invasions challenging imperial authority. When we get to the Roman Empire, we'll talk about how in the later Roman Empire, the fact that their empire was so large made it more and more difficult to protect the frontiers of their empires. And eventually, outsiders started to encroach upon the empire, putting pressure on it, and it started to shrink. Now let's talk about the Persian empires, our first of our classical era empires in the Indo-European area. The Achaemenid Empire is the first of the Persian empires we will discuss. If you look at this map, you will see it was rather large. As a matter of fact, the Achaemenid Persian Empire will be the largest empire that had been seen up to that point. Larger than the Assyrian Empire that had been the largest before it. Around 550 BC, the Achaemenid dynasty was begun in the Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great. He was the first of the Persian emperors, and this is the first of the Persian empires that will dominate Western Asia. So it is the Achaemenid dynasty of the Persian Empire. That's why we call them the Achaemenid Persians. Cyrus's 20 satrapies created an organized empire, and he treated conquered people kindly. Now, satrapies are the way that the Persians governed their far-flung empire. If you look here on this map, you will see that basically it's divided up into provinces. These are the administrative divisions within the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Each of these satrapies would have a Persian governor put in charge of them, but they oftentimes also utilized the local population, the local leadership of the areas that they conquered. This way, when they ruled over these foreign people that they have now conquered, they kept a level of trust with them by allowing their old governing structures to actually still have a role in how the area is governed. But they had to answer to the Persian officials, which of course answered to the emperor. So satrapies are a way of incorporating the local governors of a region, and that kept more peace in the empire, kept the people from wanting to rebel as often. Also, the fact that Cyrus was a fairly good ruler, ruling the people with kindness, also aided in that peaceful empire. Not all Persians will rule as benevolently as Cyrus. Herodotus, the Greek historian, wrote of Cyrus, and his nation, there is no nation which so readily adopts foreign customs. They have taken the dress of the Medes, and in war they wear the Egyptian breastplate. As soon as they hear of any luxury, they instantly make it their own. In other words, the Persians, under the Achaemenid dynasty, were great transmitters of culture, and we see lots of cultural diffusion throughout the empire as a result. King Cambyses conquered Egypt, and King Darius added western India, but was turned back by the Greeks. This will be the extent of the spread of the Achaemenid Persian Empire. By about 500 BC, Darius Empire, King Darius, who was the next great Persian emperor, was the largest in the world, with a massive army and the world's first highway system uniting it. The Persians were great road builders. They did this to keep tabs on their empire with their armies, but also to promote trade and communication. Persia's 10,000 elite soldiers were known as the Immortals as well. If anybody has seen the movie The 300, they should be familiar with the Immortals. That's what this picture is from. Persia created an imperial courier service also that carried messages throughout the empire, like a postal service, if you will. Herodotus, again, the Greek historian, noted that, quote, neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevents them from accomplishing the task proposed to them with utmost speed. This is where our postal service gets their credo. So, the Persians were the first to really have this kind of extensive postal service or courier service. Just like we have seen with other earlier kingdoms and empires, Darius and other Persian emperors considered themselves representatives of the primary god of their people. The god Ahuramazda was the primary deity of the Persian religion called Zoroastrianism. You see here Ahuramazda on the right, you see Darius on the left, and you see the crown of blessing being passed from Ahuramazda to Darius. This shows you that just like we had seen in the ancient world, there was a direct connection or a belief in a direct connection between the ruler and divine forces. Between 486 and 465 BC, the next king of the Achaemenid Persians, Xerxes, ended cultural toleration. He did not follow in his great-grandfather's and his father's footsteps. He ended the cultural toleration that had been enacted by Cyrus the Great and had been continued by his successors, including Darius. Ultimately, he also overextended the empire, trying to take more territory. He will tangle with the Greeks as well, and he will be unsuccessful. We'll talk more specifically about the Persian Wars with the Greeks later on. And this will lead ultimately to what is known as the overextension of the empire. Once he had done that, basically he had spread himself too thin and his administration too thin. And this will lead to rebellions, not ruling benevolently, as well as overextension caused financial problems as well, and rebellions will happen. Ultimately, we see by 334 BC, Alexander the Great was able to move through the empire and conquer it, ending the Achaemenid Persian dynasty. Again, we'll talk more specifically about Alexander the Great and what he does in a later lecture. Now let's talk about the next phase of Persian empires, which is smaller, called the Parthian Empire. The Parthian Persian Empire. This will be later, 238 BC. The new Persian Empire under the Parthian dynasty emerged. It had conquered what had remained of Alexander's divided kingdoms after his death. We'll talk more specifically about what happens with Alexander and with his the kingdoms that are created after his death in a later lecture. By 155 BC, King Mithradates I had restored much of the territories once controlled by the Achaemenid Persians. There's Mithridates right there, and there's Hercules. You can see they adopted a lot of the Greek traditions and religious ideas as well as their mythology because they had been controlled by the Greeks after Alexander defeated the Persian Empire, the Achaemenid Persians. The Parthians organized the empire into satraps like Cyrus had done back under the Achaemenid Empire, but they never had the centralized power that the Achaemenids did. The Parthian and Roman empires ultimately will fight for about 300 years. The Parthians would not be completely defeated by the Romans, but they would be weakened enough that rebellions would eventually bring it down. The Sassanid Empire, or the Sassanid as it's sometimes called, empire, is the next Persian Empire. By 226 AD, the Sassanid dynasty, led by Ardashir I, who overthrew the Parthians, results. There's Ardashir right there. And there's Ahuramazda. Again, you see him receiving the crown of blessing from Ahuramazda, the transition of power going to Ardashir. The Sassanids expanded their empire, even defeating Roman armies, and reestablished farming and trade networks throughout the region. There's the Persian king Shapur, who is a later Sassanid emperor. There's a Roman Emperor Valerian. You see, he is lower, he is being defeated by the Persian king Shapur. This would not last forever, however. The Sassanids, unlike previous Persian empires, did not tolerate other religions and made Zoroastrianism, their native religion, the official state religion. So that cultural diffusion that we had seen after Alexander and the Greeks had taken over parts of the Persian territories, and then they had been absorbed into the Persian traditions, that will stop. The Sassanids did not tolerate other religions. Instead, they're trying to enforce a state religion of Zoroastrianism. Christians and Jews, which were sizable religions in Persian territories by this time, faced discrimination and persecution by the Sassanid Persians. The king or emperor held a semi-divine status and relied on Zoroastrian priests to help him run the government, to be his bureaucrats. Expansion led the Persians to war eventually with the Byzantine Empire. Now, the Byzantine Empire will be the eastern half of the Roman Empire that will be left when the western half falls at the end of the classical period. We'll talk more about this later in a later unit. But these wars between the Persians and the Byzantine Empire were long and costly and ultimately unsuccessful. The Persians under the Sassanids will not be able to conquer the Byzantine Empire, although they will shrink it for a while. A Persian diplomat proposing peace with Rome, meaning the Byzantine Empire, what was left of Rome, wrote, "The whole human race knows that the Roman and Persian kingdoms resemble two great luminaries, and that, like a man's two eyes, they ought mutually to adorn and illustrate each other, and not in the extremity of their wrath to seek rather each other's destruction." By 651 AD, the Persian Empire of the Sassanids was conquered by the Arabs. Again, we'll talk more specifically about this in a much later unit. The Sassanid Empire was very weakened by all of the continuous wars that they had been fighting, especially with the Byzantine Empire, the old Roman Empire. They were weakened by war, they were weakened by high taxes, and also plague. But this all contributed to the growing political instability of the Sassanid Empire. And eventually they will be taken over by the Arab world, the Caliphate to the south, and they will lose control of their empire. Now let's talk a little bit more in general about empires of the Mediterranean region, at least the early ones. The Phoenicians, we've mentioned them before, but we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about them now. Between 1200 and 900 BC, so really before the classical period, during that earlier Bronze Age period, you see that the Phoenicians, with the Egyptians declining, there was no major military power in the Mediterranean except for the Phoenicians. Now, the Phoenicians had been more of a trade based empire in the sea, in the Mediterranean Sea, but they became sort of the dominant folks in the Mediterranean after the decline of the Egyptians, after the fall of the New Kingdom. So between 1200 and 900 BC, the Phoenicians pretty much controlled the Mediterranean basin. The Phoenicians had established their empire along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea with their capital at Tyre. You see on the right hand side of the map here where Tyre is located. This, of course, was an area also that had been occupied by the Israelites slash Hebrews slash Jews. And so the Phoenicians had been neighbors to the Israelites for many years. The Phoenicians were a seafaring people that established numerous city-states throughout the Mediterranean. Each of these city-states were really city kingdoms, however, having their own king and governing themselves independently. So in reality, we don't really consider the Phoenician territories a true empire that was ruled by one emperor that had, a bureaucracy underneath him. Instead, each of these Phoenician city kingdoms had their own independent king. And this is, I guess you would say, more like what we saw in early Mesopotamia. The Phoenicians worked with metal and built a huge wine industry as well. So metalworks were one of their big exports, as well as wine. They traded their wine in far off markets and kingdoms. It was desired by many of the Bronze Age and now Iron Age peoples. And as we have discussed before, the Phoenicians were really important because they established a phonetic system of writing to improve business transactions. This will be the basis of the modern alphabet. Ultimately, this was important because it was adaptable to all of the languages of the people that they did trade with, and this allowed for them to have more efficient record keeping, and it was only 22 letters rather than thousands of characters. Eventually, it will be adopted by the Greeks, who will add the vowels to it, and eventually that will become the basis of most of the writing systems throughout the Mediterranean region and beyond. The establishment of Phoenician colonies included the founding of Carthage along the North African coast. You see Carthage located there in northern Africa. This will eventually become the most important of the Phoenician colonies, the Phoenician kingdoms, if you will. And they will eventually tangle with Rome. We'll talk more about that in a later unit as well. Now let's talk a little bit about Carthage just in particular. By 575 BC, Tyre was conquered by the Persians, leaving Carthage as the leader of the Phoenician colonies in the west. Carthage ultimately expanded into an empire, controlling most of North Africa and parts of Spain and even parts of France. This is what will bring them eventually into conflict with the Romans, who were also growing in power along the Italian peninsula simultaneously. You can see this from the map here. The Roman territories in red, the Carthaginian territories in blue. So when you think of the Carthaginians, as they will be referred to in some of your readings as we move through these classical period units, you need to remember that the Carthaginians are actually Phoenicians. The Carthage's merchant-based economy led to immense wealth, and they eventually controlled the Mediterranean Sea with their powerful navy. Carthage was controlled by small elite groups, mainly ship owners and merchants. They were the elites in the Carthaginian Empire, and they had the most power. The colonies paid tribute and taxes to the Carthaginian elite. It was more like an oligarchy. Between 264 and 146 BC, that growing Roman Republic that we will talk about in a later unit starts to fight a series of wars with Carthage called the Punic Wars. The reason they're called the Punic Wars is because in Latin, which of course is the language of the Romans, in Latin, the word punica means Phoenician. So they knew that the Carthaginians were, of course, the descendants of the Phoenicians. In the First Punic War, the Romans took Sicily. The corvus allowed Romans to easily board Carthaginian ships. What they would do is they had these corvus hooks where they would throw them across the channel to the Carthaginian ships, and they'd pull them towards them, and they were able to easily board the Carthaginian ships and defeat them. We'll talk more specifically about these wars again when we get to the Roman unit. The Second Punic War, the Carthaginian general Hannibal crossed the Alps from Spain, moving into northern Italy by crossing the Alps, surprising the Romans. And he did so using war elephants as well. The Romans had never seen elephants. The elephants were used kind of like tanks. They would knock down city walls. And this surprised the Romans. They were not expecting an attack from Carthage from the north, instead from the south, since they, in the Mediterranean region. And this ultimately took them by surprise. Hannibal will, however, eventually be defeated, and the Romans will eventually turn and attack the capital city of Carthage as punishment and retribution. Carthage became an important cultural and commercial center during the Roman Empire after the Romans took over the territories. Now we're going to discuss briefly the Minoans and the Mycenaeans from early Greece. These are the early Bronze Age, moving into the Iron Age Greek peoples in the region of Greece that will eventually be the ones that fight, the Mycenaeans anyways, that fight the Trojans in the Trojan Wars. Ultimately, we will talk more specifically about the classical era of Greece in Unit 4B instead of Unit 4A here. So we're going to just introduce you guys to the Greeks here, and we're going to talk more specifically about the classical Greeks in that next unit. The early Greek kingdoms emerged in the eastern Mediterranean, including the Minoans and the Mycenaeans. If you look here on this map, you see the area we're talking about in the yellow circle. Those are the earliest Greek civilizations. The Minoans located on the island of Crete, and the Mycenaeans located on the mainland of Greece. The wealthy Minoan society on the island of Crete was an early Bronze Age civilization for Greece. They traded copper, tin, and other goods. They were mostly a peaceful people, a seafaring people, a peaceful people. We don't see a lot of fortifications left of these people, so it leads us to believe that they were a peaceful people. We have not really translated their system of writing, however, Linear A. So therefore, we don't really know as much about them as we do about some other earlier Bronze Age civilizations we've discussed in this class. The city of Knossos was technologically advanced, however. This is the Minoan capital, if you will, the city of Knossos on the island of Crete. It was technologically advanced with plumbing, bringing fresh water, and removing sewage throughout the region. This is a reconstruction of what they think the city of Knossos, the palace at Knossos looked like, and the city, the surrounding region. Fairly advanced society. Here are the ruins that are still existent today. You can go visit these in Crete to this day. The Minoans were forced, however, to continually rebuild due to earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Remember, we've talked before about how oftentimes empires don't just end with military problems or with economic problems that are because of military problems. Sometimes it's because of natural disasters. This will lead us to talk more about the Mycenaean kingdoms located in the Peloponnesus, that is the mainland of Greece, and they established cities, city kingdoms like Thebes and Athens. Now, eventually, these will become what are known as polises. We'll talk more about those in Unit 4B. The Mycenaeans were where they established independent city kingdoms, and they oftentimes fought with each other. They were warlike peoples. Despite initial peace, the Mycenaeans attacked and conquered the Minoans after an earthquake, and it is believed that the Mycenaeans brought down the Minoan culture on the island of Crete, taking over the region. They were more warlike, the Minoans were not, and therefore they were able to take over fairly easily. The city of Mycenae and its own kingdom eventually will later be destroyed by other rival Greek kingdoms. If you see here, you see all of those little red dots represent their own city kingdoms during this era. Around 1200 BC, we see all of these kingdoms, these little independent city kingdoms, Greek kingdoms, fighting one another. Sometimes they have to unite, put their differences aside to fight against a common foe. That's one of the things that happens during the Trojan Wars. But they oftentimes fought against each other. Sometimes historians refer to this entire time period as the Mycenaean period. So that's why sometimes we refer to them as the Mycenaean kingdoms, plural, not just the one kingdom of Mycenae, just so everybody is not confused there. So all of these the late Bronze Age Greeks on the mainland of Greece are part of the Mycenaean civilization, but each of these cities had their own king and were all independent. Sometimes they traded with each other, oftentimes they fought against each other, and again, sometimes they would have to put their differences aside to fight against a common foe, which is what happened during the Trojan Wars. We'll talk more specifically about the impact that this will have on the Greek society in the next lecture. Sum up, however, the chaotic times of the Mycenaean civilization that followed the collapse of the Minoan civilization, and then eventually will bring about the collapse of the Mycenaean civilization. This all happens after those Trojan Wars are over. Even though technically the Greeks and the Trojans will fight valiantly, and the Greeks will win the Trojan Wars, ultimately it will eventually cause a destruction of the Mycenaean civilization, and Greece will enter a period known as the Dark Ages period. And there's about 500 years where we don't really know what was going on specifically. It seems like they lost the ability to write. The Mycenaean script was known as Linear B. They seem to have abandoned that. But the old stories that would be passed on through oral tradition, word of mouth, will eventually be written down at the end of that Greek Dark Age period by the poet Homer. Homer will collect these stories of the old end of the Mycenaean period and through that Dark Age period in his epic poems, the Iliad, which is about the Trojan Wars, and the Odyssey, which is about the Greeks returning home after the Trojan Wars. We will talk more specifically about that in a later lecture and in a later class discussion.